Shabbat Shalom. When George Stephanopoulos asked President Biden last Shabbat, "Would you step aside if you were convinced that you could not win?" That is the question still lingering on everyone's minds, both here and abroad. I mean, how can it not? For his part, President Biden laughed and said, "If the Lord Almighty comes down and tells me, I might do that." I don't recall if I chuckled along too, but when someone refers to God in a casual conversation, say, at the next table or in passing, it gets my attention. But in an interview which is being scrutinized worldwide, you might just say that the phrase made me sit up. I had to wonder if President Biden had read ahead to this week's portion Chukat, because it is there that God delivers the most important message that Moses ever received. More urgent than his original call at the burning bush, more stirring than the plagues that Moses would deliver to Pharaoh, more challenging than leading the Israelites from Egypt, more difficult than receiving the commandments at Sinai. Over the long course of their relationship, God, with Moses' leadership, had cared for and accomplished great things for our people. And in Chukat, we encounter one more critical turning point that transpires between them, when God came down to deliver a message personally. You, Moses, are not going to the promised land. Take it off your list. This news came at a very important time. As we read in the past few weeks, this was a time of rebellion. For those who appreciate a brief review, last week's portion Korach asked, when is a rebellion meritorious? And what are the specific qualities to be avoided in a leader? Among them we learn hubris, disrespect, acting for oneself rather than for the sake of the common good. All of that is Torah. The corresponding Haftarah passage spoke of the time when the Israelites clamored for a king to lead them. God and the prophet Samuel, who would eventually anoint Saul as the first king, were entirely in agreement and against the idea of a king, because there is only one king, capital K, and on the practical side, an earthly king would replace the entire judicial system of judges, which we still marvel at today as a remarkable biblical innovation. And that's exactly what happened to the Israelites. When King Saul came to power, the judicial system was set aside to the detriment of all. So let me ask, does any of this sound familiar? And even though the Torah is an ancient document, we see how some of its wisdom may yet apply to our own circumstances. So now back to Moses and God's message. Miriam, Moses' sister, has died, and the miraculous well of water that accompanied her throughout their desert wanderings no longer appears. Naturally traversing the desert left the Israelites hot and thirsty, just as we were this past week, and just as they had some 40 years earlier the Israelites complained vociferously. Back then, God offered a solution, instructing Moses to take his staff, go to the designated rock, and strike it with his staff, and water would flow from it. He did, it did, and the people were appeased. Now, 4 decades later, in our portion Hukat, God offers a similar resolution to the drought. Moses was instructed to take his staff and go before the rock and speak to it, and water would flow. We can only speculate why the instructions differed this time, changing from striking the rock to speaking to it. And we can't help wonder, in the heat of the moment, whether Moses really processed that small difference. Or was he just relying on muscle memory? Maybe Moses thought, I've got this, having successfully delivered water to an angry mob once before. And countless commentators have asked, why instruct Moses to take his staff if he wasn't going to use it? Remember that this staff carried all the associations of a magic wand. It was that staff that conferred the plagues, transforming one element into something entirely different, such as turning the Nile into blood and dust becoming lice. His staff initiated redemption. When he raised it, it parted the sea. And long ago, yes, it provided water to a parched people. But now the staff was to be a prop rather than a change agent. Did Moses understand the nuance in God's instruction? Well, even casual readers of the Torah know that Moses struck the rock not once but twice, failing to follow God's command. Yet only after the fact do we learn that God was displeased when the text admonishes Moses with these words, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelites, you therefore shall not lead this congregation into the land I shall give them." For Moses, for Aaron, for us, that declaration is astounding. Moses has been grounded, and though he has more to give, his future is thwarted. As readers, we have been faithfully following Moses from the time he was placed in a basket in the Nile to watching him become a reluctant spokesperson for God, confronting Pharaoh, and then schlepping slaves toward the light of freedom, all along the way putting up with irritating delays, misbehavior, and ceaseless complaints. Tell me, where was the gratitude? Exactly where was the boundary, not of the promised land, that was clearly defined, but for Moses, the limits of his leadership? How did he suddenly become obsolete? And why now, when they weren't even close to their destination? So sudden and harsh. Or was it the moment when Aaron stood at his side before the designated water-giving rock? Two bereaved brothers, the remaining anchors of authority and stability. Yet in a flash of anger, Moses sarcastically asks the assembled unruly mob, who are increasingly agitated by their growing thirst, almost taunting them, "Hey, rebels, shall we get water from this rock for you?" Those are the words in the Torah. Was it a slip of the tongue, a stutter, a poor word choice that condemned him? Would the worst moment of his life always define him and prevent him from moving forward? Rabbi Ilana Zeitman notes, when Moses and Aaron failed to remind the people, and worse, themselves, that their power comes from something greater than themselves, it was then that God decided that they were acting more like pharaohs, little pharaohs, than God's prophets. And in modern terms, this is the case of a leader who arrogates to himself or herself a power or authority that is not in their control. The biblical scholar Dr. Aviva Zornberg offers a different insight when she writes, "The physical intervention that was necessary for the Israelites who had emerged from slavery in Egypt was in fact detrimental to this new generation, who needed to be shown a different verbal way to achieve their goals. What was once an effective teaching tool, the staff, is now to be replaced by the use of language," she said. What God wants is to educate the people to their new post-wilderness lives in the land and to the practices that will enable them to live in a new place and time. Zornberg sees this as a missed opportunity to shift confidence in a leader to empowerment of the community. If Moses had had the presence of mind to approach the water-giving rock as God had commanded, he could have engendered a deeper respect for God on the part of the new generation who stood before him. And at the same time, he would have also demonstrated that he possessed the bandwidth to pivot as a leader and grow too. Not long after the encounter with the rock, Aaron dies. Moses himself takes Aaron's priestly garments off and places them on Eleazar, Aaron's son. If Moses had been oblivious to his own mortality earlier, the message that continuity requires change stood before him in the form of his nephew who succeeded his father. In Sefer HaChinuch, we learn that the very last of the 613 commandments is the expectation that every one of us, will write a Torah scroll for ourselves. And why? It answers this way: lest their souls be sick of reading the old scrolls that their parents had left them. Rabbi Michael Strassfeld comments, the idea that a new generation's soul might be sick of the old scrolls requires a broader understanding, explaining that the Torah of the new generation needs to be experienced as entirely fresh by that generation. And isn't it true that every generation yearns to write its own fresh chapter, while their elders hope that they will do so, yet embracing the wisdom that they inherit? This very moment that we are living in and through may feel as though we are at a crossroads. Yet this process of renewal and change is truly part of life every day. We feel it most powerfully and personally when a Moses is refused entry into his promised land, whatever that may be. Yet our work is to continue to write our own Torah. As Rav Kook taught, the old must be renewed, and the new must be made holy. Kain Yehi Ratzon, may that be our portion too.